All right, so aside from the soggy day and probably the soggy weekend we have ahead of us, there's something else that to me is a bit soggy. This whole potentially manufactured crisis. Notice how this whole rail situation it went from being not really on anybody's radar to inside of 24 hours, it became the news story, and it was going to be apocalypse now. Supply chain hell. Nobody can get from point A to point B because apparently people in news media think far more people ride Amtrak than actually do. But it was that big of a story, right? And then as quickly as the story became the biggest deal that was going to cripple this country, in the middle of the night, Joe Biden steps in, and before you know it, we have an agreement in place. Then the morning yesterday, he calls a press conference to take credit for it. Now, one of two things has happened here. Either Joe Biden is actually the art of the deal president, and he really did step in there in the middle of the night, and by God, Biden got something done. Or there's more to that story. Something to me just doesn't smell right, especially when we know these labor unions tend to be in the back pocket of whom? So I'm skeptical, but I'm also curious to get the thoughts of one Sean Themea, the Young Americans for Liberty. Sean, what do you make of this situation?
Brian, thanks for having me back. And, I agree with you. I mean, this is spin at its finest. This is how I see it. You've got the union bosses and the railroad CEOs. They've already pretty much come to a deal around 2 a.m. the other day, right? And it's a tentative deal. Keep in mind that this hasn't been totally agreed upon. And then someone wakes up Sleepy Joe from his nap at 2 a.m. He makes one phone call, and the Democratic machine wants to spin this as, oh, Joe's a friend and the savior of the working man. Look at this. This is great. But we all know he's not. This is the same guy who canceled the Keystone Pipeline on the first day of his presidency. This is the guy who was harassing and insulting factory workers throughout his whole campaign when they asked him basic questions. This is the guy who's printing and spending money and hitting the working man in his pocket, eating his lunch with inflation. So this is just a president and administration who's desperate for a win, desperate for spin, and they will take advantage of any situation they can.
Sean, it seems like there's been increasing propaganda from Team Biden. I mean, right down to, his backfiring speech recently, where he is trying to put out all of these various different personas that are just so obviously artificial. I mean, including the inflation celebration. I mean, there are just a lot of weird oddities all of a sudden. Do you think that this might have been almost a staged event? In other words, he saw opportunity here and, had nothing to do with this deal, but this was going to be another, propaganda moment for him, and maybe even to a certain extent labor unions playing ball with them?
Yeah, show me in politics what isn't a staged event these days. What isn't propaganda? I mean, come on, does anyone actually believe that Joe Biden sat down and brought these people together and was a great unifier the couple weeks or a week or so after he called half of the country enemies of the state? I mean, come on. Anyone who buys this is too far gone. And one other thing about this agreement, too, this deal, I mean, look, I'm not necessarily opposed to increasing the wages of workers. I mean, the working man has been hit harder than ever. But a 24% increase in salary over 5 years for these railroad workers, that's not going to keep up with Biden's inflation. So he's taking credit for this. He's saying, look at me, I'm such a big man. I'm a friend to the working man. But then he's going to eat up that whole salary increase at the rate he's printing and spending money until he gets out of office. So this is nothing more than wagging the dog. This is all a stunt. And I don't think the American people are buying it.
Yeah, to your point about the 24% being over the course of 5 years, and you take a look at the rate of inflation that we've been pacing since Joe Biden became president, there is definitely a point to be made there. Hey, Sean, while we have you, curious to get your thoughts about the Martha's Vineyard illegal immigrants. Were they kidnapped by our Governor Ron DeSantis, or is this pretty absurd reaction by a bunch of woke people?
Well, I think confrontational politics is the most effective way of making change. I mean, you've got to go directly to these decision makers' homes and show them the impacts of their bad policies. A politician will only move if they are pressured, so you've got to keep the heat on these people. You can't assume that just being nice is going to, make us freer. But at the same time, I mean, look, these people that were promised, and my understanding is they were promised, hey, you're going to Boston, you're going to get a nice place to stay and everything. And all of a sudden they show up at Martha's Vineyard. Everyone's confused. I mean, these people shouldn't be used as pawns. These are real people. They're fleeing, these war-torn areas, many of which, our deep state has helped to break up. So I agree with the confrontational politics model, and I agree with, getting in the face of these politicians, of these woke elites. But, I don't like how it's at the expense of real people who are just looking for a home here.
Here would be my counter to that, Sean. So these are Venezuelans. It is not possible to get from Venezuela to the United States going through without going through other countries when you're coming across the border that way. So, if it's true asylum they are seeking, they were not legitimate asylum seekers because you have to declare asylum in the first country that is non-hostile that you come across. And so herein lies with the illegitimacy of all of these asylum seekers. Under international law, technically the only ones that are ever legit are coming across the southern border specifically would be those from Mexico. So, ultimately, isn't this the point that, yes, they might really be in a tough spot? We know Venezuela is a nightmare on wheels, but it does not make them any more legal based upon the way they chose to do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And I've heard some other folks, in my circles, they say, look, DeSantis sent these people over to Martha's Vineyard. Why is he sending them further into the country? Why didn't he send them back to where they came from? So there's many ways to look at the issue, I suppose, at the end of the day.
Sean Themea, Young Americans for Liberty. Appreciate it. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you got it.